Hello and welcome on this, here it's drizzly Wednesday evening. Thank you for joining me here in the Samson Historical Study. I'm Abby Samson, your host, and as you can see, fall has very much set in here in the study. It's one of my favorite seasons. Those of you who you've been seeing out on the road, thank you so much for coming up and your encouraging words and saying hello. I very much appreciated it. It was wonderful meeting you in person. For those of you we haven't seen yet, we hope to see you down the road. I apologize for not being here last weekend. I was a bit under the weather. The only benefit to that was I get to do one of my favorite things when I'm sick and snuggly, and that is read. And because it is fall, I am very excited to bring up one of my favorite ghost stories from when I was a girl. So ghost stories and folklore have been around since the beginning of people, since we could talk and tell each other stories. And those stories have started locally and spread across the country as we have spread and populations have moved. And there's one particular story that I think you'll know, but may not realize that it has very deep 18th century origins. And so now we're going to talk about this famous specter of the 18th century. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. Have you guessed it? So this is by Washington Irving, and Irving was born in 1783 and died in 1859. And he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was actually published in 1820. So you might wonder, why are we talking about that here when we mainly talk about 18th century history? Well, that would be because the legend of Sleepy Hollow doesn't necessarily originate with Washington Irving, though he is the one to write it down. This particular folklore dates back to the Revolution. So Irving started collecting his inspiration in 1798 after fleeing New York and to get away from the yellow fever outbreak. He went out to Tarrytown. Now, Tarrytown is was a small little town and out in the country to get away from, again, the disease that was spreading in the city. And it was so named, according to Irving. This name was given it, and we are told, in the former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. So the women named it Tarrytown because their husbands went to tarry while they were at market, which, be true or not, is a very cute story. And it happens to be just across the river from where Major John Andre was captured and hung. And you'll hear reference in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow to Major Andre's tree, though I doubt that he would like to claim ownership of it. But the real location of our tale happens outside of Tarrytown, in a little valley, perhaps about 3 miles away, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. The sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. So, Sleepy Hollow is a real place. There's no debate about that. But what there is debate about would be who inspired these characters. And 3 of the main characters that we're going to look at today all have 18th century roots, and there's a little bit of conjecture on who Washington Irving based them on. So the first would be our school teacher from Connecticut, Ichabod Crane. And I really hope that the person that Washington Irving based Ichabod Crane on did not know they were the inspiration, because the description is not necessarily very flattering. Though he is described as a ladies' man for his singing voice, so I suppose he did have some redeeming qualities. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large, green, glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. Like I said, it's not super flattering, but there are several options for contenders for the making of Ichabod Crane. And the first would be an Ichabod of the New Jersey Cavalry that Washington Irving may have met when he was in the service. There was also many Cranes as a prominent family in New York society. So it could just be that he pulled the name that he knew from, again, these prominent figures that were in New York where he was living. There was also which sounds pretty good, a contemporary of Irving, Colonel Ichabod Crane. Unfortunately, for the Colonel Ichabod Crane, he did not likely meet Washington Irving, though they were contemporaries at the time. He was a colonel in the Marines. There were the possibilities there, but according to every source that I looked at, there really wasn't a lot of opportunity for them to cross. So, in my opinion, he probably used a combination of names for a good story. One thing that is very important about Ichabod Crane, and it actually is a throwback to a 17th century reference, and that is that Ichabod Crane, the character, was a firm believer in Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, published in 1693. And so that is a book about witches and the occult and the Salem witch trials. And Mather was a big proponent in that. And so Ichabod, the character, is very much into that superstition. And you see that throughout the story, and as well as other small local legends that get thrown into this. The next would be Katrina von Tassel. Now, Sleepy Hollow is very much a Dutch area, Dutch settlement. And so we have a true, actual Katrina von Tassel, Katriana, but she would have died before Washington Irving made it to the area. And so, but the von Tassel family was big in Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. And so it's very likely, in my opinion, that he stole, again, her name, and maybe based the looks of the lovely Katrina off of her niece. So he's much, much nicer to Katrina in his descriptions of her looks. And so he describes her as the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting, and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches. So she is quite the little lady. And so, again, having never have likely met the true Katrina Ecker von Tassel, who is buried in the old Dutch churchyard, which that'll come up in just a moment, he likely based her looks after her niece Eleanor Brush von Tassel, who would have been a little younger at the time of his visits. And so the old Dutch churchyard, we need to talk about that for a minute. The old Dutch church is actually predates the 18th century, so it was already the old Dutch church when Irving got there, and prior, when these legends were starting during the Revolution specifically. And it has a large graveyard that, honestly, by all accounts, is very spooky. And I imagine it was still spooky in the era, but that's going to be very important. It's a very important place in the story, and it's actually a very important place in the local legend. And that brings us to the horseman. So from Katriana's headstone, you can actually see the unmarked grave of a Hessian soldier. So when we originally talked about this, we called it the Headless Hessian. And it's really funny how it has turned into the Headless Horseman, but there is, in fact, a Katriana von Tassel, and there is, in fact, an unmarked grave in the old churchyard with a Hessian soldier in it. So, the horseman. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle in the Revolutionary War. This is where the real 18th century history comes in, and the speculation and the interest in it. And so there's actually two different theories that we're going to talk about today. The first theory is going to be the Hessian in the churchyard. So as we discussed, there is an unmarked grave and the local lore around that. So the British and Hessian soldiers came into Sleepy Hollow, came into Tarrytown as they were advancing on New York. And one of the theories is that they when they came in and confiscated the weapons of the local farmers, there was resistance. One family is said to have been searched and found with a firearm in their house, and the house was then torched. The other was that Cornelius and Elizabeth von Tassel resisted the taking of their weapons, and the house again was lit on fire. So those are things that we know. Likely, there's provenance for that. There is a precedent to say that could have happened. Whether it was Cornelius and Elizabeth or one of the other residents, somebody's house was likely set on fire. And unfortunately, it was done in haste, and a young girl was accidentally trapped inside the home. And again, that was not the intention, as far as any records show. However, one of the Hessian soldiers that was there with the British Army rushed into the home and rescued the girl. And the girl did survive, according to the tale, but the Hessian soldier did not. And so they were not super popular, the Hessians and the British at the time, for obvious reasons, depending on what circles you played around in. But the girl's mother, and the story we'll call her Elizabeth. The girl's mother, Elizabeth, was very moved by this act and grateful to have her daughter back. And so she insisted that he be given a Christian burial. That being said, not everybody was really on board with that idea. They buried him in the churchyard, but they did not mark the grave. So there was a bit of compromise there. And it's there to this day, again, unmarked, near the von Tassel family. And so that's theory 1. So keep that in mind. Then we have theory 2, the Battle of White Plains. So on October 28th, 1776, you have the Battle of White Plains. And what we have here is a sketch. As you can see on the north side, you have that Hessian encampment, as well as the on the far right, and then the rebels are marked in yellow. So this was by no means actually a small unnamed battle in the Revolution. The difference there is we didn't win. So this took place in White Plains, New York. It was a George Washington versus General Howe battle, but it ended in a clear British victory, which I don't know if Irving is just, truly removed from it, that it's just a battle, didn't care. My thought is maybe he was a little bit more of a, some unnamed battle, because it was one that America did not win, did not reflect well on us strategically. And in that you have these German mercenaries that are paid by England, and that's in many battles in the Revolution. There's actually around 34,000 German soldiers paid to fight on the British side in the American Revolution, and that's important. They were all kind of lumped in being called Hessians, even though only 18,000 of them were, and those were from Hesse Castle in Germany. And forgive me, my German is not good. It may be worse than my French, but so you have these soldiers all being called Hessians, so they are German, and but they're all being paid by England. And so after this engagement, you have Major William Heath, and he recorded a report after a brief holding action on November 1st. So the battle took place October 28th, around at November 1st, and he reports that a cannon took off the head of a Hessian trooper and killed a horse. I like to think that may be the more likely culprit for our headless Hessian, and maybe where he got his horse. Either way, that is probably an unpleasant way to go, and likely might turn you into a ghost. But I like to think it's a combination of both things. And so Irving repeats this local folk tale. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is the amount of local history that he pulls in. And especially in that area, has helped that local folklore endure. And so one very interesting fact here is that Washington Irving himself is also buried in the old Dutch church graveyard with the Headless Hessian, with Katrina Van Tassel. And though Ichabod Crane, you'll have to figure out what you think happened to him. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently at a furious speed were traced to the bridge beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside, a shattered pumpkin. So, you'll have to read the tale, or join us later in the week when we read through the tale of Ichabod Crane and Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and decide what happened to poor Ichabod, and if he is in fact in the old churchyard, if he's in Sleepy Hollow at all, or if the Hessian finally found his head. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and I hope that you enjoy our spooky story and are having a wonderful fall. We'll see you again next week.